History isn't always written by the biggest army. We tend to think of the past as an inevitable story, a straight line from then to now. But what if everything we take for granted, the country we live in, the language we speak, was decided by a single desperate gamble? A battle that, by all accounts, should have been lost? Today, we're exploring the unbelievable medieval conflicts where the underdogs didn't just win, they completely rewrote the future. These are the moments where strategy, courage, and sometimes sheer luck forged nations, broke empires, and shaped the world we know. If you're ready to dive into these epic stories that changed the course of civilization, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button on the video. It really helps us keep bringing you this kind of content. And after watching, leave a comment telling us which medieval battle you think is missing from this list. Let's get started. Let's start on a lonely ridge in Sussex, England. On October 14th, 1066, this is the story of how one brutal day of fighting wiped a kingdom off the map and created a brand new one. This is the Battle of Hastings. The whole mess started when the English king, Edward the Confessor, died without an heir. That kind of power vacuum is a recipe for chaos. The throne went to Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in England, but his crown was shaky from day one. Across the English Channel, the formidable William, Duke of Normandy, insisted the throne had been promised to him. He started building a massive invasion fleet. As if one invasion wasn't bad enough, Harold had another problem. The fearsome Viking king, Harald Hardrada, landed up north with his own army. In a feat of incredible endurance, King Harold marched his army 200 miles north and absolutely crushed the Vikings at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It was an amazing victory, but it left his army battered and exhausted. And just days later, the news he was dreading arrived. William had landed on the south coast. So Harold had to turn his weary army around and march the entire length of England again. He gathered what fresh troops he could and set up a brilliant defensive position on a ridge near Hastings. His army, all on foot, formed the legendary Shield Wall, a brutal, overlapping wall of wood, steel, and spears. They were exhausted, but they had the high ground. At dawn, William's Norman army advanced. This was a modern combined arms force: archers, infantry, and their ace in the hole, heavily armored knights on horseback. William opened with his archers, but the arrows just bounced off the high wall of Saxon shields. He sent his infantry slogging up the hill. They couldn't break the line. Finally, he unleashed his ultimate weapon, the thunderous charge of the Norman knights, but even they couldn't shatter the shield wall. They were met with a forest of spears and the terrifying swing of the two-handed Saxon axe. For hours, the battle was a bloody stalemate, and the Normans were getting desperate. And this is where William pulled off one of the most famous and riskiest gambits in military history. A group of his knights suddenly broke and fled down the hill. Seeing their enemy running, some of the English, against Harold's direct orders, broke formation and charged after them, yelling in triumph. It was a trap. The fleeing Normans spun their horses around and tore into the now exposed Saxons. Seeing it worked, William did it again and again. Each time, they lured more Englishmen off their nearly impregnable hill to be cut down in the open. The shield wall was thinning, but it was still holding. Then, as the sun began to set, disaster struck. According to historical accounts, an arrow fired high into the air, arced down and struck King Harold, possibly in the eye, killing him. With their king gone, the English resistance finally crumbled. The aftermath was a complete reset for England. William the Conqueror was crowned king on Christmas Day. The Anglo-Saxon ruling class was almost completely replaced by Norman lords. The English language itself was changed forever, flooded with French words. Law, government, society, it was all remade. Hastings didn't just pick a new king. It ended the Anglo-Saxon world and created the medieval England that would shape Europe for centuries. From a battle that created a nation, we jump forward a few centuries to a battle that saved an army and humiliated an empire. We're going to a muddy field in northern France. On October 25th, 1415, this is the Battle of Agincourt, one of the greatest underdog victories of all time. The setting is the 100 Years' War. The young English king, Henry V, had invaded France, but his campaign was a disaster. ravaged by disease. He was now leading his small, starving army on a desperate race to the coast, but the French cut him off. A colossal French army, fresh, confident, and outnumbering the English by at least 2-1, blocked their path. There was nowhere to run. The English force was perhaps 6,000 to 9,000 strong, and the vast majority weren't knights. They were archers with longbows. The French army was a vision of feudal power, with modern estimates putting them at 12,000 to 15,000 men, including thousands of heavily armored nobles eager for glory. The battlefield itself was key. It was a narrow patch of plowed farmland, squeezed between two dense woods. This funnel meant the massive French army couldn't just surround the English. And to make things worse for them, the ground was a muddy swamp after days of heavy rain. As the French prepared their attack, Henry V made a brilliant tactical move. He had his archers carry long, sharpened wooden stakes and plant them in the ground, creating a hidden deadly fence against cavalry. Overconfident, the French advanced. Their first wave of mounted knights charged, expecting to punch right through the English line. Instead, they rode into what a witness called a terrifying hail of arrows. The English longbow was like a machine gun of the Middle Ages. Skilled archers could fire upwards of 10 arrows a minute in short bursts, and the sky turned black with them. Horses panicked, riders fell, and the whole charge collapsed into a chaotic, mangled mess before it even reached the English, with survivors getting impaled on the hidden stakes. Undeterred, the second French wave, this time on foot, started their slow march across the field. Weighed down by heavy plate armor, they were exhausted just from trudging through the thick mud. All the while, the English archers rained arrows down on them. An arrow might not punch through a breastplate, but with thousands of them flying, they found the gaps, visors, joints, and limbs. When the exhausted French knights finally stumbled into the English line, they were too packed in and tired to even swing their weapons properly. And then, the English archers, having run out of arrows, dropped their bows, grabbed hatchets, swords, and mallets, and swarmed the trapped knights. These lightly armored archers moved easily over the mud and just slaughtered the exhausted French nobility. A third French wave, seeing the catastrophe ahead, simply refused to advance. The battle was over. It was a shocking, unbelievable English victory. Agincourt was a national humiliation for France, which lost a huge chunk of its nobility in a few hours. For England, it was a legendary triumph, but more importantly, it cemented the longbow as a weapon that could dominate a battlefield. It proved that disciplined infantry could destroy elite, armored knights. It was a sign that the age of chivalry and the mounted knight was coming to an end. Our next stop is in the fields of Poland on July 15, 1410. This isn't a story of an underdog. This is a heavyweight title fight between two of the most powerful forces in Eastern Europe. This is the battle that shattered one of the most feared military organizations in history, the Battle of Grunwald. For over a century, the Teutonic Knights, a German crusading order, had been waging a brutal holy war against the pagan Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But the game changed when Lithuania's Grand Duke, Jogaila, married the Queen of Poland, converted to Christianity, and became King Władysław II Jagiello. This united Poland and Lithuania, creating a massive new power. Suddenly, the Teutonic Order's whole reason for being crusading against pagans was gone. War was coming. In the summer of 1410, two gigantic armies met near the village of Grunwald. On one side, the Teutonic Knights, perhaps 20,000 strong and disciplined, professional army of German crusaders and mercenaries in cutting-edge armor, led by the arrogant Grandmaster Ulrich von Junglingen. On the other, the huge multi-ethnic army of the Polish-Lithuanian alliance, numbering around 30,000. It was one of the largest battles of the entire Middle Ages. The Teutonic Knights were so sure they'd win, they tried to taunt their enemies into attacking. The Grand Master even sent two swords over to the Allied commanders, an insulting dare to start the fight. But the Allies refused to take the bait. Finally, the battle kicked off. As the Teutonic heavy cavalry charged, Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania initiated a daring plan. a fake retreat. This was a classic step tactic the Lithuanians knew well from their fights with the Mongols. A huge part of the Lithuanian cavalry appeared to break and flee. The knights, thinking they'd routed half the enemy, broke their tight formation and charged after them. It was a fatal mistake. The chase pulled a huge portion of the knights away from the main fight and threw their ranks into chaos. With the Teutonic army split, the Polish heavy cavalry smashed into the knights that remained. The fighting was incredibly ferocious. Then, at the perfect moment, the fleeing Lithuanians rallied, wheeled around, and crashed into the rear of the Teutonic army, trapping them completely. The battle turned into an absolute slaughter. The Grand Master himself was killed in the chaos. Along with most of the Order's leadership, the result was catastrophic for the Teutonic Order. Their military power was permanently broken. Hundreds of the Order's elite brother knights were killed. Although the Allies didn't manage to take the Order's capital city, the knights never recovered. The battle marked the rise of the Polish-Lithuanian Union as the dominant power in Eastern Europe for centuries to come. To this day, the Battle of Grunwald is a cornerstone of Polish and Lithuanian national pride, a symbol of a united victory against a common enemy. Let's now head to northern France on August 26, 1346, to witness one of the first times gunpowder changed the course of a medieval battle. This is the Battle of Crécy, where the age of chivalry received another devastating blow. The setting is the early Hundred Years' War. England's King Edward III had invaded France with a relatively small army, but was being pursued by a massive French force under King Philip VI. The English, outnumbered and far from home, chose a defensive position on a hill near the village of Crécy. The English army, about 9,000 men, was organized in a revolutionary formation. Instead of relying solely on heavy cavalry, Edward positioned his dismounted knights in the center, flanked by large groups of longbow archers. And here was the innovation. Some primitive cannons, called bombards, were positioned between the English lines. These were crude, unreliable weapons, but they made a terrifying noise and could knock down a mounted knight. The French army, estimated at 25,000 men, was an impressive collection of medieval warfare's finest: heavily armored knights, Genoese crossbow mercenaries, and supreme confidence in their numerical superiority. The battle began badly for the French. Their Genoese crossbowmen advanced first, but were met by a storm of English arrows. The English longbows outranged the crossbows and had a much higher rate of fire. To make matters worse, the Genoese had left their protective pavises in their baggage train. Under intense pressure, they began to retreat. King Philip, furious at what he saw as cowardice, ordered his cavalry to charge through the retreating Genoese. "Kill that rabble who are blocking our way," he allegedly shouted. The French knights trampled their own allies in their rush to reach the English. Then came the surprise. When the French cavalry charged uphill, they were met not just by arrows, but by the roar and smoke of English cannons. The horses, never having heard such noise, panicked. Knights were thrown, ranks broke, and what should have been a devastating charge turned to chaos. Wave after wave of French cavalry charged uphill, only to be torn apart by English archers and terrified by the cannons. King Philip himself was wounded in the battle. His brother, the Count of Alençon, was killed, along with thousands of other French nobles. But the true tragedy of the battle was the death of King John of Bohemia, one of Europe's most respected knights. Blind and old, he asked to be tied between two knights so he could participate in one last charge. All three were killed in the melee. Crécy marked a turning point in medieval warfare. It not only demonstrated once again that disciplined infantry could defeat elite cavalry, but also introduced firearms to the European battlefield. The cannons at Crécy were primitive, but they heralded a new age. The combination of longbows and gunpowder meant that the dominance of heavy cavalry was coming to an end. Our final battle takes us back to France, 10 years after Crécy, for one of the most shocking events in medieval warfare, the capture of a king on the battlefield. This is the Battle of Poitiers. On September 19, 1356, England's Black Prince, son of Edward III, was leading a raiding army through France when he was intercepted by a much larger French force under King John II. The French had learned some lessons from Crécy this time. Most of their knights were dismounted, and they had developed new tactics to deal with English archers. The English army, about 8,000 men, found itself trapped near the city of Poitiers. The French army, estimated at 16,000 men, outnumbered them 2-1. To make matters worse for the English, the terrain didn't favor their usual defensive position. It seemed they would finally be crushed out. But the Black Prince was a brilliant commander. He positioned his army behind a hedge, with only a small gap through which the French could attack. This approach would force the French into a frontal assault through a narrow bottleneck. The battle began with a charge by French cavalry, but this time they were more cautious. Advancing slowly through the narrow gap, they were met by a concentrated rain of English arrows. The French formation compressed in the bottleneck, creating perfect targets for the archers. What followed was a brutal, prolonged fight. The French, fighting mostly on foot, pressed against the English lines. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. Then, the Black Prince executed a brilliant maneuver. He sent a detachment of knights on a secret flanking movement through the forest. At the crucial moment, when the French lines were fully committed to the frontal assault, this force struck the French rear. Caught in a trap, the French army collapsed. But the most shocking was yet to come. In the confusion of battle, King John II himself was surrounded and captured. A French knight who had switched sides shouted, "Sire, sire, surrender or you are dead." The King of France, the most powerful man in Western Europe, became a prisoner of the English dot. The capture of John II was an unprecedented disaster for France. The country was left without leadership. The government collapsed, and the English demanded an astronomical ransom, 3 million gold crowns, a sum so vast that France took years to raise it. The king remained a prisoner in London for 4 years, and when he was finally released, he died shortly after. Poitiers demonstrated that even kings weren't safe on the medieval battlefield. It also showed how intelligent tactics and well-chosen terrain could overcome numerical disadvantages. The battle left France in ruins for a generation and established England as the dominant military power in Western Europe. So, a new England forged on a hilltop, the beginning of the end for the armored knight in a muddy field. A superpower shattered in the forests of Poland, the first roar of gunpowder echoing across France, and a king captured in his own land. These weren't just bloody days. Hastings didn't just crown a king, it created a new kind of England. Agincourt didn't just save an army, it signaled that technology and tactics were becoming more important than chivalry and armor. Grunwald didn't just defeat an army, it broke a crusading state and raised a new empire in its place. Crécy introduced the sound of gunpowder that would echo through the centuries, and Poitiers showed that even kings could fall when the fortunes of war shifted. These were the pivotal moments where history turned on a dime. The world we live in was truly forged in the fire of these battles, and you can still hear their echoes in the languages we speak, the borders on our maps, and the nations we call home. Medieval warfare wasn't just about brute force. It was about adaptation, innovation, and the courage to bet everything on a single desperate gamble. These battles remind us that history is never inevitable, and that sometimes a single day can change the destiny of entire civilizations.